We'll welcome Nicole now if you want to share your screen. Nicole Maness is the lead for the Willamette Partnership's work on habitat conservation, and she focuses on connecting science, policy, and people to come up with innovative ways to protect and restore ecosystems throughout the Pacific Northwest. She currently serves as the coordinator for the Willamette Oak Prairie Cooperative and is the co-founder of the Oak Accord. We're happy to have her here today to talk about the oak and prairie restoration supply chain.
Great, thanks Alexis, and good morning, good afternoon. Last presentation before you get a break, so thanks for staying engaged, and hopefully this is a bit of a thought-provoking conversation or discussion that I'm hoping to start here. I wanted to thank Tom at the beginning for the land acknowledgement, and to thank the conference organizers for doing such a great job. From the presenter side, this has just been an awesome kind of network of being engaged and being organized. So just deep appreciation. Just wanted to go over what I'm going to share with you today. I want to talk about what the restoration supply chain actually is and why it's really important. Describe some of the challenges or pinch points that I'm seeing and that my conservation partners are seeing as we're working in kind of this new world order of fire and climate and scale. Highlight a couple of really awesome models and case studies that are happening that we're engaged with, and then just share some reflections or takeaways before we close out and have time for some discussion and questions. So before I start, just want to acknowledge a couple of key partners and groups. Matt Blakely-Smith, who's the Stewardship Director for Greenbelt Land Trust here locally in Corvallis, and Jenna Knobloch, who is the Wildfire Program Manager at Sustainable Northwest, have been really helpful in kind of informing different components of my talk. And also want to acknowledge the work that I do with a group called Pure Water Partners Program in the Mackenzie Watershed, and also with the SageCom Partnership and their Invasives Initiative out in Eastern Oregon. A lot of lessons learned taken from my work at Willamette Partnership with that group. And then just a couple caveats. When I am not an expert in kind of seeds or native plant materials or even on the ground restoration, I work at a really higher scale around kind of collaboration and policy development. So just want to provide that context in terms of my expertise. Secondly, this is not an exhaustive look at this issue. This is kind of a high level examination of the system that we're seeing and that we're starting to adapt in these different groups that we're working with primarily in Oregon. And then just to share that this really is pulled from a lot of experience in Oregon, but that this isn't specific to a lot of the wildfire work that's going on. I think there's a whole subset of kind of lessons learned and takeaways that come from that wildfire response work. So I include a little bit of this, but this is really not specifically about wildfire response. So what is the restoration supply chain? I'll admit that I Googled this just to make sure that it was either a thing or if it wasn't a thing, that I was being accurate in talking about it or starting to describe it. But basically it's all the inputs and components and elements that are needed to restore degraded ecosystems, from the native seeds and plants that go into the ground, to the workforce that does things like grow or process those materials, transports them, prepares the site, plants them, to the equipment that's needed for things like site prep or thinning or planting. And then all the stuff in between, the connective tissue in the system that makes all that happen, from conservation planning, to getting the funding in place, to writing up contracts, to transporting and storage, to maintaining sites, to providing training and certification to the workforce, to having insurance. All those different components are really an essential part of the supply chain. And why is this an important question for us to consider in the conservation community? One of the reasons that I agreed to give this talk, or was interested in putting this talk together, is that as the coordinator of a group called the Willamette Valley Oak Prairie Cooperative, at some point we are going to apply for a grant through our watershed, our state level watershed board, for about $12 million to do on the ground restoration work in oak and prairie systems in the Willamette Valley, looking to influence or work on hundreds of thousands of acres. And a lot of the groups that I work with in oak and prairie systems and also in sagebrush systems are thinking about both their planning and implementation at really large scales. And some of the grant opportunities that are coming our way, and some of the new funding sources that are coming out of things like the infrastructure bill, we're talking about millions and millions of dollars of work. So thinking about pairing our ability to meet that kind of demand for restoration work at scale is really critical. The second is around kind of building resilience into our system. I think you've heard and are going to hear about the impact of a changing climate, and specifically around wildfire. In the West, we're dealing with more intense and more frequent wildfires. And so we're going to have to update our systems that are in place to help restore these impacted landscapes. So not only updating the policies and programs that help to kind of service the restoration work that goes into post-fire response and recovery, but also to start to incorporate things like the human toll of people who are working on wildfire response. So a lot of folks that are doing restoration in these landscapes have been directly impacted by the trauma of living through a fire season and are working in the sort of their backyard to do a lot of the recovery work. It's also exhausting work emotionally and physically. And so just starting to account for the more multidimensional nature of restoration work is important in this fire-dominated environment. Sort of the impact of a changing climate, I think, is something that we're all thinking about and starting to work more practically on. So how do we restore systems that are actually adaptive to a changing climate? Also, how do we respond in the restoration community to an increased demand for carbon sequestration? A lot of entities are talking about going carbon neutral and wanting to meet those obligations or to meet their sort of impacts on climate through things like afforestation and restoration. So that's really increasing the demand for the materials and all the other components that go into restoration work. And then finally, I think everybody in the conservation community is looking at their work through a lens of equity and diversity and inclusion. How do we start thinking about who we're hiring, what training opportunities we're providing for those kinds of organizations that we want to be working with, that we want to be promoting and uplifting and sharing power and sharing resources with. So where are we putting the investment in our restoration environment into? So those are all really important drivers in the work that I do and in the work that my conservation partners are doing. A couple of observations around the challenges or pinch points that we're seeing in that supply chain. So in terms of materials, and I think Patricia's presentation did a great job of kind of highlighting what's out there in terms of seed supply, but connecting that supply and demand is something that we're going to have to start getting better at. It takes a lot to sort of anticipate what the supply needs will be in specifically a wildfire season, but also thinking at scale. As I'm thinking about putting together a proposal for $12 million worth of work in the Willamette Valley, where is all that seed and native plant material going to come from? What's the lead time in terms of putting in orders? How do we make sure that all of the supportive infrastructure around transportation and storage is available to us to make sure that we're doing this really sort of seamlessly and efficiently and well? That takes a lot of coordination and having a really holistic plan to think about implementing that kind of restoration at scale. We are looking at the need to update our species specifications, so having potentially new planting standards and new recommendations around species mix, not only for seeds and plants that are going to survive in new sort of future climate conditions, but also during that planting season. So we have anecdotal evidence that there was up to 80% mortality in that heat dome that the Pacific Northwest experienced in, I guess it was summer of 2021. That's a pretty significant impact and a huge cost to the investment that's already being made. So how do we make sure that we're accounting for those extreme climate events that are happening, not just in the future, but now? And then thinking about planting for multiple objectives. So we have, restoration work specifically for habitat objectives, but also planting more fire resilient forests and also meeting those carbon offsets. So I work with a program that's trying to engage more vineyards in habitat protection and restoration around oak. And I had a conversation last week with an interested landowner who wants to meet their carbon their net zero carbon goals through an afforestation project. And oak savanna is really the most sort of needed and ecologically appropriate restoration plan or design for that site. But we were having a conversation about what the carbon sequestration opportunities were for that project. And there was a, not a debate, but certainly a weighing of those multiple objectives. Can we meet both with the same kind of restoration plan? What data do we have to back that up? So that's sort of a new context that I'm starting to work in for sure. And then just recognizing that there are pretty significant production shortages kind of across the board. So the impact from those carbon commitments are increasing demand. We have increasing wildfires, which is also increasing demand, and then labor shortages across the board. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail here. So the restoration sector right now is really seeing a lot of wage competition with other sectors, primarily forestry and construction. There's a lot of crossover in the restoration and the timber industry, and it's really hard to get folks to work right now because there's so much action on timberlands. So we have one contractor in the Willamette Valley who's been working with clients for a long time, and he's having a hard time keeping his 30-member crew going. He's losing them to the construction industry because wages are just that much higher. And he's actually having to talk about raising his prices to be able to retain those laborers and thinking about how we pass those costs on. So the grants that have been written to fund that restoration work aren't reflective of that new competitive labor force. And grant reviewers are looking at those increased costs and sort of questioning, are we really getting the same value as we were for those dollars? And so the need to be sort of updating and reflecting what we're seeing in the marketplace is really critical. Seasonality is another issue that we're dealing with in the restoration community and what makes that workforce kind of less competitive. So we have one contractor here in the Willamette who does amazing work, and he's really having a hard time trying to retain labor who they're just seeing other opportunities that are able to generate more income for them and provide work opportunities across the year. Scale is another issue for contractors in particular. They're seeing the sort of investment that needs to get made around doing a lot of small contracts really difficult. And also that kind of seasonality issue means that they're not able to necessarily be as efficient as they would be in kind of deploying materials and equipment across the landscape. And then just a need for sort of more training. I think there's a lot of specialization in riparian restoration in this part of the Willamette Valley, but we need a lot more expertise in kind of upland restoration. And then also thinking about training diverse crews who mostly speak Spanish and any kind of specialized training in Spanish language. So the last is around equipment, and I don't think this really comes as a big shock or new observation to anyone, but it's just really expensive. So, if you're looking at $100,000 for a skid steer and an implement, plus $50,000 for a truck and a trailer, plus incidental costs for storage and maintenance, that can be a high bar to kind of starting up or expanding business to meet that increased restoration need. And as the conversations that I've been having over the last couple of years, looking for ways to innovate in this space and not really seeing a lot of opportunities for innovation. So sharing equipment is problematic. People need the same equipment at the same time. How do you share the costs for if there's a breakdown or for maintenance? So looking for more opportunities around innovation. And I'd love to hear in the chat or in the discussion later, examples where people have seen that, like low or no interest loans, to try and encourage and incentivize more companies to be starting up. And then again, all the kind of stuff in between that connective tissue, contracting, that was a big issue in kind of responding to the fires, where having standardized contracts in place ready to go would have meant mobilizing that workforce a lot faster. There was a lot of paperwork that had to happen and it kind of delayed or slowed down how quickly crews could be responsive. Thinking about coordination, who does all the coordination at the systems level to make sure that we're addressing these pinch points and creating a more efficient system. Thinking about things like accessibility, especially in the light of disaster. It was, sort of an unintended or unexpected barrier that people are doing everything on their cell phones if they've been part of a fire. Roads aren't accessible. As we're having more floods, as we're having more fire, we're needing to rethink what accessibility means in terms of getting to these sites. Timelines, again, really sort of tied to that fire response and recovery, but the idea of getting paperwork together and getting contracts or grants submitted within a 3-month timeframe post-disaster is kind of unreasonable. So needing to think about extending timelines of how we deliver money and funding to stand up restoration services. And then just thinking about the role of trauma in all of this. Great, thanks for the time warning. So I just want to highlight a couple of examples of folks that are working on this. The Pure Water Partners group in the Mackenzie are a collaborative of conservation organizations, municipal and state agencies, water utilities, and wastewater management organizations that are working to build a resilient watershed. They were primarily doing that through recruiting private landowners to do riparian and upland restoration. But after the 2020 fires, they totally updated and adapted their system to respond to the impacts from fire. And so they kind of retooled their collaboration to apply for emergency funds, to reach out to landowners and sign access agreements to do kind of the restoration work on the ground, to get materials ordered, and kind of do that across the watershed. And that was happening in different fire affected communities across the Willamette. And so Sustainable Northwest started this group called the Western Oregon Cascades Recovery Effort to think about how to create a network of networks and really mobilize all the lessons learned from that particular group. In the name of time, I'm just gonna kind of skip through these other examples because I really want to get to my lessons learned. Because I feel like this is kind of the important section where I'm hoping to get some feedback and engagement for the group. So really thinking about kind of the future in terms of the workforce as a major limiting factor. I think looking at innovations like aggregating contracts and thinking about how to support year-round work for the workforce are really areas where we have to focus. Thinking about diversifying our training opportunities, so bringing more skill sets in and actually offering more Spanish language training would be a real benefit. And that group, the Western Oregon's Cascade Recovery Effort, is actually hosting a contractors forum next year to think about how to ask contractors what can we do to really address the needs that they have. Another is getting smarter about kind of financing and budgeting. There's a lot of money coming our way. There's over $3 trillion for forest restoration work coming through the infrastructure bill. And our state Department of Forestry got $5 million for implementation. So we need to think about how we're going to use that money and how to sort of be the change that we want to see in the world. We're also going to need some new partnerships and kind of that connective tissue to connect all these different groups together. And the power of working together collaboratively actually takes groups that specialize in collaboration. So we need to think about funding the kinds of groups like Pure Water Partners and Sustainable Northwest who can come in and look at that system, kind of take a holistic approach to how we do that, and to really start to think about building new partnerships and new systems and updating our policies and programs so that we can be responsive to this kind of new environment that we're working with. And then really, I think bringing a lot of compassion to the system. We're working in a world of the urgency from climate change. We're working in a pandemic. We're working in the sort of new fire system in the West. People are tired. People are strained, and being compassionate about the context that we're all in, I think, is a huge benefit of these kinds of interactions, and just being supportive of each other, lifting each other up looking for ways to be supportive and encouraging and kind. And I think that applies to conservation partners. It applies to our agency partners. We have awesome partners here in Oregon, and I would say that they all bring compassion to the table when they're thinking about the work that we're doing, and it's deeply appreciated and it makes a big difference. So I wanted to just close with that thought, and happy to take questions and have a little bit of a discussion in the time that we have left. So thanks.
Thank you, Nicole. That was a great presentation. I think really important things to think about. And so just real quick, a reminder, we have some minutes for questions, and I'll be pulling them from the Q&A box icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you see a question you would like answered, please like it so that those questions get put to the top, and then we can make sure we get those answered. So I will start with the first question for you. Have you had the capacity to engage volunteers in restoration efforts? There may be potential in your community to help widen pinch points of contractor workforce seasonality challenges.
Yeah, great question. We get a lot of requests for people who do want to volunteer. I think there's a sense that actually being on the landscape and kind of contributing with your time is really valuable. I think for a lot of the work, so I have a partner that does a lot of volunteer work on an oak woodland restoration program, and it takes a lot of his time to do that organization, to get people to the site, to find a day that works for everybody, to make sure people have gloves and boots, to make sure that it's a safe environment. I have a lot of corporate partners who want to come and actually not only contribute their dollars, but also their time. So I think there's a trade-off. I think it's possible, depending on the kind of work, to create programs where we can increase the number of meaningful volunteer opportunities without having it be a burden on the organizer to do the training, to ensure the safety is in place, to pay for coffee and all that kind of stuff. So it's that trade-off. I will say that as someone who does get to volunteer through a land trust that I'm a part of, it builds a kind of connection, engagement, and just supportive nature, and that compassion that's really irreplaceable. So I would love to do more of it. I recognize that there are really legitimate logistical challenges around it. And so I think it's a trade-off. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then we have another question. Are getting workers the main problem, or is it paying the workforce? In my experience, trying to obtain jobs, there's typically around 100 or more applicants for every job posting in restoration conservation.
Yeah, that's interesting that folks are seeing that different tension. The conversations that I'm having in the Willamette are definitely around kind of the difficulty around retention. This is probably a relatively new system that we're in, where you both have a lot of demand and probably a lot of opportunity for work in the restoration sector. At the same time, you've got this other tension of there being a high competitiveness for wages. So I think it's unclear where that's going to settle out. I recognize that we're in a really unusual time right now. I mean, I think if I'd given this talk in 2019, it would have actually been a really different talk. The wildfire season in Oregon has dramatically shifted our perception and our perspectives of the new reality that we're facing. And, in terms of supply chain and the amount of dollars that are available, the amount of construction that's happening, why the timber industry is kind of exploding right now. There's so many different economic forces at work. I think it'll take it a while before the dust settles and we have a clearer sense of if we're going to have a stable system or not. So it's great to hear that some people are seeing that it's actually there is a labor supply and that it's hard to find that work. But what I'm hearing on my side is that it's definitely a retention issue. So one of the contractors that we work with, he has 70% of his crew is here on a temporary work visa from Mexico. And that's how he's providing services to his clients to do the native habitat restoration that he's contracted to do.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. And then how do you balance emergency demand for plant materials for wildfires and planning for those wildfires? The agency bureaucracies are definitely a challenge.
Yeah, again, that tension between kind of recognizing that we need to update our systems, and updating our systems is a really real one. I think given the scale at which we need to work and the speed with which we need to be responsive, I think there's a need to have really honest conversations with our agency partners about how we do this, and recognize that there's actually huge opportunity for kind of innovation and maybe for some private sector organizations to come in. So I'm sad that one of the examples I skipped was this native seed source partnership that started up in Eastern Oregon. They're actually looking at the provision, or sort of the collection and processing of native seed as a rural economic development opportunity. So they're providing trainings, they're helping small businesses start up, and they're trying to generate kind of a restoration economy in the Great Basin as a way to provide employment, but also to meet that lack or that gap in native seed. So I think the private sector could play a huge role here, and that EcoSource Native Seed Partnership that's being supported by High Desert Partnership out of Burns, Oregon, is an awesome example of how we can kind of bring the private sector to fill in some of those gaps. They can be a little bit more responsive to kind of the market forces, and use more of a business case to think about providing supply to the restoration economy.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do your budgeting considerations also include long-term monitoring and management and salaries for people to be involved in projects long-term, or is it all focused on implementation and working with contractors?
Yeah, not enough. And I mean, this has been an issue across the board for all of us for a long time. I once maybe naively posited that all of our budgets should just have a requirement of, you take 20% of your grant project and you put that in a bank account, and that's what you spend after the project, or after sort of your granting period has ended, that we all need to be investing in that piece. I think it's an underserved and under budgeted component. And, I think I'm a little bit spoiled working in Oregon. We really have such a responsive and engaged group of partners that we get to work with from really the granting side as well. And those folks are really open to these ideas. I think if, as a community, we're starting to elevate some of these issues, there's strength in numbers. If we're all saying that we need to be more considerate or more mindful of these different kind of pinch points, and here's some clear examples about how we're addressing them, and we're all saying that, I think that's what it's going to take to start changing some of the systems and updating some of the policies. One of the benefits of there being so much kind of instability and uncertainty in the system is that it's a great opportunity for change. And so that connective tissue, the work that Sustainable Northwest is doing, a lot of the work that I get to do at Willamette Partnership, it's around extracting that wisdom and trying to share it with our policymakers, with our decision makers, elevating those issues and really making the case that we're going to get more efficiency in the system, we're going to get better outcomes, and it's going to be more success for conservation in the long term. I think we need a lot of voices kind of shouting that from the rooftops, and I'm willing to be one of those voices.
That's awesome. Thank you. I think we have time for about one more question. And do you see potential in alternative funding sources such as carbon credits as a means to fund restoration projects?
Oh, I hope so. I really hope so. I mean, so my organization, Willamette Partnership, we got our start really in sort of the ecosystem services markets world. And we sort of transitioned away from that work over the last decade. We weren't seeing it really happen at scale. But we're starting to come kind of full circle back to the place where kind of private money and the idea of incentivizing where money goes through markets I think in the carbon world, as we're seeing this just rapid scaling up of work in kind of carbon sequestration, the idea of driving to net zero, there's just going to be so much money in the system that we have to figure out a way to harness it to our benefit. And I think that's what a lot of groups in the conservation finance world are trying to figure out how to do. How do we make the business case for conservation? Where do we look at where money is available? And how do we get it doing smart things for our ecosystems and for our rural communities as well?
Great, thank you. I think that's all the time we have for questions right now. And I wasn't able to look through the chat, but it seemed like it was really active and a lot of great things. So thank you again, Nicole. This was really great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. I see there's a couple unanswered questions in the Q&A, and then yeah, there's been a lot of great discussion in the chat happening. So this was a really great presentation and looking at the bigger picture of our plant material needs. So thank you. And with that, we have come to our first break. You can see that Finley and Cheddar, my cats, have gone off to have their lunch and take a walk in the sun. Thankfully, it's sunny here today in Oregon. So hopefully everybody can enjoy a little bit of a break, stretch your legs, have some lunch. And we will be starting again at a little before 1, about 5 minutes till 12:55 Pacific time, to start our first Southwest session. So we will see you all back again in about an hour and a half. And in the meantime, also don't forget to check out the community boards. I posted those links from Lindsay. I actually started a whole new traditional ecological knowledge board. I also saw a lot of links being shared in the chat. So please feel free to reshare those links on that community board in Whova. And then check out all the photos, the beautiful photos being posted, and vote for your favorites. And so with that, we will pause for lunch. Thank you.